Welcome to Part 3 of Herbert Has Been Murdered. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 11. 2:15 a.m. to watch by night. Lieutenant Williams flipped through the leather-bound reference book in front of him, then dialed the number he had memorized. "Is this Mr. Thomas Hollander?" he asked when a man's voice answered. There was a smooth, almost soft quality to it that hinted at a southern accent. "May I ask who's calling?" the voice continued, confirming Williams' suspicion about the man's origin. "I have a message from the home of Mr. Herbert Franklin for Mr. Thomas Hollander. Could you please ask him to get on the line?" "Just a moment." "Of course." Lieutenant Williams doodled stars on a notepad as he waited. He idly wondered what secret traits or hidden flaws might be revealed if a trained graphologist analyzed his drawings. He created a rather nice star and added dramatic rays shooting out from its points. That would likely indicate to any observer that he was a curious, critical, and cold-hearted detective. Why was it taking so long to get Hollander to the phone? Had the line gone silent? "Yes," a deeper voice responded this time, lacking any trace of southern gentleness. "Mr. Thomas Hollander." "Yes." "This is the home of Mr. Herbert Franklin." "Okay." "I'm Lieutenant Williams with the police." A heavy silence hung on the line, stretching out longer than usual. Then the voice broke the stillness. "Well, Lieutenant, what's going on?" "It concerns Mr. Franklin, Mr. Hollander." "Yes. Yes." Another pause followed. "He's dead." "Dead? No, Mr. Hollander. Were you expecting him to be?" "What do you mean, expecting him to be?" "I certainly was. Let's get to the point, Lieutenant." "I was just about to do that. Mr. Franklin has suffered a heart attack due to some sudden shock. His condition is serious, and Dr. Jameson, who is looking after him, insists that a friend be nearby when Mr. Franklin regains consciousness." "You mean," his voice turned cautious, "besides Mrs. Franklin?" "No, unfortunately Mrs. Franklin cannot be there." Another pause, then he asked, "Why not, Lieutenant? She isn't, that is." "Excuse me, Mr. Hollander. Is she under arrest?" "Certainly not." "What for?" "Well, what are you officers doing here if," the tone softened, "there hasn't been some sort of crime?" Lieutenant Williams remained calm and unruffled. "We can't be certain whether or not a crime has occurred until Mr. Franklin regains consciousness and tells us." "He's unconscious." "Yes." "Is his condition serious, Lieutenant?" "Very serious, Mr. Hollander." "And Mrs. Franklin, why can't she be with Herb?" "Dr. Jameson has given her a sedative. She's sleeping. Her nerves are frayed." It clearly took a moment for that to sink in. "From what, Lieutenant?" "From her husband's condition." "Did Mrs. Franklin ask you to contact me?" "No. Smithers, her maid, mentioned that you were a friend, a mutual acquaintance. Smithers told me that your name is the only one Mr. Franklin has ever spoken of in a way that suggests closeness." "That's right. You and Mr. Franklin are close friends, then?" "Very close, Lieutenant. What do you need me to do?" "I'd like you to stay with Mr. Franklin until he regains consciousness. Dr. Jameson is concerned that Mr. Franklin's heart may fail again if there isn't someone he knows by his side when he wakes. If you come upstairs, Dr. Jameson can explain everything much better than I can." "Of course, yes, when?" "As soon as you can manage." "In about an hour. There are a few things." "That will be just fine. Thank you very much, Mr. Hollander. Goodbye." "Goodbye." Lieutenant Williams set down the receiver of the hall phone and walked over to where his coat and hat were hanging. He put them on and intercepted O'Brien at the front door. "O'Brien," he said, "there's a man named Thomas Hollander coming here shortly." Please have him prove his identity with a visiting card, a letter, or some form of ID. Also, give him a quick check to ensure he isn't carrying a weapon. If he takes offense, just tell him it's standard procedure. In his case, that's likely true. Please take him up to the room where Dr. Jameson is staying for the night. Yes, sir. From Dr. Jameson's room. He will be escorted to Mr. Franklin's room and will remain there until morning. Yes, sir. I need you to inform the guards down here that I'll be leaving for the night. Let Mr. Hollander know that if he asks for me, I'm stepping out now and may be gone for a couple of hours. I will return. I'll knock on this door, and you can let me back in. Yes, sir. There should be a lounge or something in that room just down the hall. I'll spend the night there. Yes, sir. Who is the gentleman arriving? Thomas Hollander, Lieutenant. Great. Lieutenant Williams stepped outside. The familiar calm of the evening air washed over him as he took a deep breath of the chilly night. He walked the short half-block to Fifth Avenue and stopped a taxi. Sliding into the back seat, he gave the driver, through the partially opened window, the Riverside Drive address of Nancy Norwich. Chapter 12. 2:30 a.m. Madame Suarez stirs up trouble. The taxi traveled north along Fifth Avenue for several blocks before turning left into the barren, frosty stretches of Central Park. The park was empty of pedestrians, with only the occasional yellow light illuminating the deserted benches and vacant paths. Lieutenant Williams pondered the strange phenomenon of how people reacted when confronted by the police. He believed those reactions often had little to do with the current situation. Instead, they seemed to reflect a subconscious retreat to an earlier time when that individual had committed a misdeed or harbored a secret that could land them in trouble. No one, himself included, led a perfectly innocent life. Even the saints had their moments of atonement, suggesting past wrongs that necessitated their redemption. It was the same for everyone. Even the most unsuspecting bystanders felt a wave of fear when faced with law enforcement. There was an instinctive urge to defend oneself against the chance that their past might resurface. Take Hollander, for example. Every word he had uttered during his phone call seemed to be a way of shielding himself from suspicion, yet it didn't directly tie him to the attack on Franklin. No, not directly. It was clear Hollander had anticipated something would happen to Franklin and was worried about the possibility of Mrs. Franklin being involved, but that didn't mean he was implicated himself. The taxi came to a stop. Lieutenant Williams stepped out, paid the driver, and waved him off. Riverside Drive felt noticeably colder than the bustling Midtown area. Was it 10 degrees cooler, or perhaps 15 or 20? A biting wind swept in from the Hudson River, cutting across the treetops of the terrace park. As he surveyed the facade of the building that contained Nancy Norwich's apartment, Lieutenant Williams noted that she had done quite well for herself. A groggy and somewhat irritable young man lazily asked, "What floor, and who's there?" as he stepped into the sweltering lobby. The sight of Lieutenant Williams's gold badge quickly jolted him awake. It turned out that he needed to go to the 14th floor. Given that it was around 1 in the morning, Lieutenant Williams was quite surprised when the door swung open promptly after he knocked, and even more taken aback by the querulous voice that came from beneath a wig barely visible in the dim light of the foyer. "Well, I must say, you certainly took your time getting here. Hang your coat and hat on that table over there, then come into the sitting room." Lieutenant Williams obliged, following a dim outline of jet-black fabric into a better-lit room filled with gold-leafed furniture and rich brocades. "I'm Madame Suarez, Nancy's mother. I'm not Spanish myself, but if anyone ever was, it was my late husband, Alvarez." The wig atop Madame Suarez's head didn't clash with the embellishments of her low-cut dress. Its reddish-brown strands were styled in an elaborate pompadour, with stubborn little curls peeking out in unexpected places. Her face had a peculiar resemblance to a polished nut, as if nature had whimsically added features. "Now, tell me right away, Mr. Franklin, what you've done with my little Nancy." Lieutenant Williams studied a closed door at the other end of the room with curious eyes. I expected to find her here, Madame Suarez, he replied quietly. Isn't she? She's not here, and furthermore, Mr. Herbert Franklin, you know she is. Her voice rose to a shrill pitch, though it lacked any real volume. It was more like the feeble chirping of a tired bird. What makes you say that, Madame Suarez? The strands of fake jewels, clinging precariously around Madame Suarez's slender neck, trembled defiantly. And you didn't meet her here at 7, she declared. I suppose you'll claim you weren't supposed to meet her here at 7. I have this note to prove it, here. She handed Lieutenant Williams a piece of notepaper that carried the strong scent of perfume. Make yourself at home, Ma. Herb Franklin was supposed to meet me here at 7. He didn't show, even though he was supposed to take me to the Colonial for dinner. I'm going to the Colonial now to see if he's there. Maybe I misunderstood him, Ma. I'll be home soon anyway. Nancy. And now it's after 1 a.m., Madame Suarez said. She knew you were coming to see her, Madame Suarez. I telegraphed her this afternoon. I'm here for a week. Where is she? I don't know where she is, Madame Suarez. Mr. Franklin, one more lie like that, and I'll call the police. That's fine, Madame Suarez. You see, I am the police. The lively sounds, the bugles, the jewels, the laughter, suddenly fell silent, as if a sudden break had pulled everything to a halt. You belong to the police. Yes, Madame Suarez, Lieutenant Williams. He displayed his badge. Then you aren't Mr. Franklin. No, Madame Suarez. Then she, they've done it, Lieutenant, they've run away. Madame Suarez began to simper. I'm sorry, Madame Suarez, but they haven't run away. Mr. Franklin was attacked this evening. If he doesn't survive, whoever did it will be charged with murder. Madame Suarez's tone was devoid of any emotion. And you think Nancy did it, she said. Not necessarily. Your daughter may have run into someone else at the Colonial, some other friends, and decided to join them when Mr. Franklin didn't show up. The Colonial is closed now, but perhaps she went on to a nightclub. I wouldn't worry too much. Why would she go to a nightclub when she knew her mother was waiting for her here? Madame Suarez's thin hands, adorned with cheap rings, fidgeted nervously with whatever they touched. Something happened to her, Lieutenant, she continued. I always told her it would. Nancy, I must have told her 100 times, if not more. There's only so many fools one can play at once. You think perhaps it was a jealous man who attacked Franklin first, then went after her. Not just one man, Lieutenant, but men. That girl had more suitors than a queen, if you catch my drift. She's not your daughter, is she, Madame Suarez? She was Alvarez's only child, from his first marriage, a Spanish woman from Seville, if you must know. What tipped you off? The way you spoke of her. But please continue, Madame Suarez. That pendant is truly remarkable. It's rare to see such a flawless ruby. May I? Madame Suarez smiled coyly as Lieutenant Williams leaned in, studying the piece of costume jewelry with great intent. My late husband always said that nothing was too good for pretty Miramar. That's my name, Lieutenant Miramar. Few are as fortunate in their names as you, Madame Suarez. Now, if I could rely on your female intuition, what did Nancy truly expect from Franklin? Madame Suarez leaned in closer, an air of chaos swirling around her. Every last cent she could squeeze out of him, she replied. Lieutenant Williams flashed his most charming smile. Barely a love affair, I'd say, Madame Suarez. Had he a moustache, he would have twirled it. I wonder if her early marriage left her embittered, hardened towards men. Well, if it did, I haven't noticed it. Perhaps Franklin fell into the category of business rather than pleasure. Well, yes and no. A fortunate mix. Just a mix, not all that fortunate. A bit of arguing here and there. A whole lot, actually. Is that so? Nancy was on stage, was she? If you can call it a stage nowadays, Lieutenant. She was in the chorus, right? Yes. and Harry Norwich saw her, and whisked her away. Madame Suarez laughed, a sound cultivated over time. Unfortunately, it was quick to be heard. "The millionaire marriage," she gasped. "My dear," her hand settled on one of Lieutenant Williams's knees. He didn't have a dime. She must have been disappointed, then. Disappointed, Madame Suarez nearly screeched, her voice sharp as a bird's call. Her demeanor shifted, taking on a cryptic air. "Let me tell you what I know," she said. "You can trust me, Lieutenant. Little Miramar isn't as dim-witted as some people I could mention, but won't. I'll teach her not to leave me stranded like this." "So you think Nancy is deliberately staying away from you?" Lieutenant Williams took in the entire scene, considering it to be quite the tangled mess. It seemed clear. Madame Suarez either knew for certain that Nancy had a hand in Harry Norwich's death, or she had manipulated Nancy into believing she did. In the end, it appeared that Madame Suarez had drained Nancy of every penny she could manage. "Is Nancy easily frightened, Madame Suarez?" "About certain things." The reddish, dusty curls nodded vigorously. Lieutenant Williams glanced at his watch. It was 1:30. He stood up. "Thank you for meeting with me, Madame Suarez. If I give you my phone number, would you call me when Nancy gets here? Or will you be asleep?" "Leave your number, Lieutenant." Her face, with its worn veneer, seemed even more peculiar. "I have a thing or two to discuss with that woman." She lifted a bejeweled hand and held it tantalizingly close to Lieutenant Williams's lips. He brushed softly against her chalky skin, offered her his friendliest smile, and made his way to the door, feeling somewhat burdened. He paused briefly in the small foyer. After putting on his hat and coat, he jotted down the Franklin's phone number on one of his cards. He turned back to deliver the card to Madame Suarez, but she wasn't in the room where he had left her, and the other door was slightly open. He moved quietly to peek inside. There she was. He had to convince himself it was really her, sitting in front of a dresser. Her wig was off, and her heavily painted face gazed into the mirror, framed by wisps of grey hair. As the frail, trembling voice rose and fell, Lieutenant Williams caught snippets of what Madame Suarez was saying. "He didn't know if I told her once. I told her 1,000 times. He didn't know." Then came a short, painful sound that passed for laughter. "But I know, Miramar knows, darling, you little pest." Lieutenant Williams stepped back quietly. He left the card on a table and slipped outside, closing the door gently behind him. He called for the elevator and shut his eyes as he waited for it to arrive. Sometimes, life felt too exhausting to observe so closely. In the lobby, he used the house phone to ring the Franklins. "Lieutenant Williams here," he said. "O'Brien, sir." "Is everything quiet?" "Yes, indeed, sir." "Has Mr. Hollander arrived yet?" "He just got here, sir. He's upstairs with Dr. Jameson now." "Did he verify his identity properly?" "Yes, Lieutenant. He showed his cards and driver's license." "Great. I'll be there in about an hour. Goodbye." The cold wind pushed against him as he walked east toward Broadway. He found a taxi and told the driver Hollander's address on East 52nd Street. He settled back and closed his eyes, soon drifting off to sleep. Chapter 13. 1:01 a.m. Glittering eyes. Nurse Murrow wasn't exactly asleep. It was more of a light doze, teetering on the edge of wakefulness. It wasn't until the second soft knock that she got to her feet. Someone was tapping at the hallway door. She glanced at her watch as she made her way across the room, relieved to see it was just after 2 o'clock. In 3 or 4 hours, dawn would break. She could grab some coffee then, and her night's work would be nearly finished. As she turned the key in the lock, she felt a sudden rush of curiosity when she noticed the 2 police officers, alert and silent, sitting in the doorway of the bathroom with their guns drawn, resting at their sides. She opened the door to find Dr. Jameson, wrapped in a camel's hair coat that muted his usual authority, standing in the hallway beside a stranger. "Miss Murrow," he said, "this is Mr. Thomas Hollander, the friend who will be keeping watch over Mr. Franklin. He's fully briefed on the situation, and I've given him instructions." "Yes, Doctor." Dr. Jameson stifled a yawn. "Are there any updates?" "No, Doctor." "Then I'll return to my room. Please call me at the slightest sign of a change." "Of course, Doctor." Hollander stepped inside, and Miss Murrow locked the door again. She observed him as he took a few hesitant steps towards the bed, the natural uncertainty that one feels when approaching someone very ill. He was an attractive young man in his 30s, though she quickly corrected herself. He wasn't conventionally handsome, not in the predictable way that would be tiresome. Engaging, perhaps. His physique was perfectly proportioned, with broad shoulders and a slim waist, reminiscent of a boxer, an amateur athlete, she thought. As he turned to face her after peering down at Franklin, Miss Murrow revised her impression of his profession. She imagined him more as a sailor, a yachtsman. He moved with a grace, as if he were accustomed to gliding over the surfaces of shifting terrain. His eyes, except for one quick flash, didn't quite meet hers. "Is it okay to smoke?" he asked. Miss Murrow offered a small, apologetic smile. "I'm afraid not, Mr. Hollander. Mr. Franklin needs the air as clear as possible. I've even cracked that window a bit to keep the room fresh." She gestured toward the window above the large mahogany chest, which was raised about 6 or 7 inches from the bottom. "Oh," Hollander remained standing before her, still creating that unusual sense of motion. There was nothing overt about it. He was like a solid mass under the drift of passing clouds. "Will Dr. Jameson be here when Herb wakes up?" Nurse Murrow felt a professional stiffness. "I'll notify Dr. Jameson as soon as there's any sign of him regaining consciousness." "How?" "I'm sorry." "How will you let him know?" "By going up to his room, of course." "Oh," Hollander's gaze drifted to the line of her chin. "Then I'll keep an eye on Herb until you return with the doctor. The doctor and I will likely be back before Mr. Franklin actually regains consciousness." "Aha, good kid, Herb." She decided to probe a little. "You and he are close friends, Mr. Hollander." "Buddies, war buddies." Miss Murrow's thoughts flashed back down memory lane. "How wonderful! So few friendships from the war have truly lasted, Mr. Hollander. It's been that way for me and many others." A faint blush tinted her pale cheeks, making her appear younger again. "There was a girl with me in the hospital at Chaumont, and we were certain we'd be friends for life, but she lives in Akron, Ohio." "Aha." "We wrote fairly regularly for a while after we returned from France. We both sailed from Brest on the America, but then it kind of fizzled out. Just postcards, picture postcards at Christmas. Last year we didn't even send any. I wonder what she'd be like if I saw her again. Have you ever thought about people you once cared for, about whether they change over time, I mean?" "Everything changes." "Doesn't it? Just like the seasons. I really believe you can draw so many joyful comparisons between life and nature. They're connected, if you know what I mean. That's why the weather affects me so much. I can't help but feel down on a gloomy day, and when it's bright and sunny outside, I feel that way, too." "Wow," Hollander murmured quietly. "What did you say, Mr. Hollander?" "I said that was nice. I take it you and Mr. Franklin see each other fairly often." "Now and then." "I guess it depends on your business." His gaze shot at her like a sharp jab. "Where will I sit?" he asked, as Nurse Murrow drifted away into her work. "Near the patient, please." She wondered if he meant to put her in her place. It wasn't exactly a put-down, but yes, it felt that way. What of it? He was handsome enough to get away with it, and it was probably just a matter of bluntness anyway. Many strong men could be brusque, often to hide a sensitive side. Here was a man, a millionaire at that. Hollander was back beside her. She pondered whether it was true, whether people who avoided eye contact were those you couldn't trust. "What do you know about all this?" he asked quietly. "About what, Mr. Hollander?" "About the police being in the house. Isn't it just too exciting?" "Aha, who do they suspect?" Miss Murrow began to feel warm toward him again. He was quite charming. She wished she had a wealth of thrilling and significant news to share with him, something that would keep him there, listening, while she could simply gaze at him and try to grasp the source of his captivating presence. They haven't revealed who they suspect, really. She lowered her voice to a more suitable tone, but it seems they think it's someone in the house. Hollander's voice dropped to a whisper. You wouldn't say they think it's Mrs. Franklin, would you? Miss Murrow appeared slightly taken aback. Oh, it's just too terrible to consider that a wife would harm her husband, but it does happen. She mentally listed the daily headlines she had read. In fact, it seems to happen almost every day. Oh, you can't possibly think. Of course, I don't think she did it, Hollander interjected fiercely. It's what the police believe that concerns me. What makes you so certain they'll pin this on someone in the house? Miss Murrow gestured toward the bathroom door. The way they're protecting Mr. Franklin from further attacks. From being attacked, she emphasized, before he can give a statement. So they're still just speculating. Just speculating. That seemed to satisfy Hollander, and he managed to signal that the conversation for him had reached its conclusion. Miss Murrow moved to her chair in the corner of the room and sat down. He was profound, she reflected. Yes, a thoughtful man, with deep feelings. Christian and Hanson leaned back in their chairs a bit, loosening their collars as they settled in for the final tiring hours of the night. They had nodded briefly at Hollander, who had returned the gesture in kind. To them, he seemed like a good guy. Just one of the regulars. Christian tried to remember that last bit of nonsense the lieutenant had mentioned about Hollander. Something about cats. Yes, 2 cats, that was it, watching a wandering and nearsighted mouse. Ridiculous. Hollander chose an armchair and moved it close to the head of the bed. It was a plush, heavy chair with a tall, sturdy back. He positioned it so that its back faced the bathroom door, giving him a slight barrier from Nurse Murrow's view. Nestling into its soft depths, he made himself comfortable. His gaze meandered across the bedspread until it settled with an intense focus on the smooth, expressionless face of his friend Franklin. At that moment, the pupils of Hollander's eyes narrowed, shining like the tips of 2 bright pins. Chapter 14. 1 a.m. An empty sheath. Just after 2 o'clock, Lieutenant Williams stepped onto the pavement and handed his fare to the cab driver. The cab lumbered away, leaving an unsettling silence hanging over the street. The apartment building where Hollander lived featured an entrance at the English basement level. Williams scanned the names on the buzzers, spotted Hollander, and pressed the button. After several attempts, a voice crackled through the intercom. "Who is it?" the voice demanded, with a southern drawl. "This is Lieutenant Williams with the police department," he replied. "Oh, Mr. Hollander has already left, Lieutenant." "Thank you, but I'm here to come upstairs." "4th floor, Lieutenant. There's an automatic lift." "Thanks." The door clicked open for him, and Lieutenant Williams entered a tidy little lobby before stepping into the elevator. He pressed the button for the 4th floor. "Sorry to trouble you," he said, as he exited into a private foyer, and was met by a young man waiting for him. "Not a problem at all, Lieutenant." "That's very gracious of you, Mr. Smith, Lieutenant, Jerry Smith." "Since when?" Williams inquired gently, as he followed Smith into an adjacent room. "Excuse me." The young man halted, his warm, dark eyes fixed intently on Williams from a somewhat worn yet still youthful face. Williams took off his hat and set it on a nearby settee. "It's nothing serious, Mr. Smith," he said. "Just the fact that I saw you last month in a lineup at headquarters. It was related to some nightclub incident, if I recall correctly. That case fell apart, didn't it? I believe the woman involved decided to forego a trial rather than endure the scandal that would come from pressing charges over her lost emerald necklace. That's all I meant, Mr. Smith. I suppose there's no way I could convince you of my innocence." "No, I don't think you could. It was simply bad luck that the case didn't go to trial, Lieutenant. I could have cleared my name back then." "That's nonsense. You could have filed countercharges, sued for damages due to wrongful arrest." Mr. Smith looked utterly stunned. "We in the South, sir, do not bring charges against a lady." Well, the moral difference between stealing a woman's necklace and bringing charges against her is a bit too fine for my northern sensibilities to understand. Lieutenant Williams casually walked over to a chair near the secretary and took a seat. Please, Mr. Smith, sit down and tell me a bit about your friend Thomas. He is the most honorable and upright gentleman who ever lived, sir. Why? Mr. Smith launched into a praise that would have made even a hardened ruler blush. Lieutenant Williams let him talk, his ears absorbing the enthusiastic words while his eyes discreetly examined the papers scattered across the desk. Tom, darling, let's have tea on Thursday at the Ritz. 4:30 as Herbert. Lieutenant Williams didn't see the need to flip the page. Instead, his fingers idly toyed with the leather sheath that likely housed a metal paper cutter or perhaps a stiletto. Yes, he is indeed an honorable and upright gentleman, sir, and if you think there's anything amiss with him concerning the Franklin business, Mr. Smith temporarily crossed north of the Mason-Dixon, are mistaken. Mr. Smith finished his argument. How long has he known Franklin, Mr. Smith? As I've said, Lieutenant, ever since that night, he saved Franklin's life. Lieutenant Williams suddenly focused intently. Would you mind telling me about that incident again, Mr. Smith? Well, it's just like I said, Lieutenant, during the war. Oh, naturally. Franklin and Hollander were in the same unit, and Hollander saved Franklin's life. You can verify it, sir, if you'd like. Just call the Bronx Armory and ask for the adjutant, in the morning, of course, since he won't be there now. He'll make it official. Oh, I believe it, Mr. Smith. It's a perfectly reasonable explanation for why Franklin should be so close to one of your friends. I promise you've got me all wrong, Lieutenant. I had nothing to do with that shady business. Mr. Smith scrambled for a fitting analogy, like an unborn child. Honestly, it's not my place to judge, Mr. Smith, even if you did, Lieutenant Williams said gently. He tapped the leather sheath in his hand against his fingers. I suppose Hollander was quite noticeable at the wedding when Franklin got married. Notable, he was the best man. Is that so? Well. Mrs. Franklin is a truly beautiful woman, and from everything she's shared with me, a much misunderstood one. Mr. Smith perched carefully on the fence, remaining alert. It must have been quite a dilemma for Hollander, Lieutenant Williams continued thoughtfully, when she told him this afternoon, during their tea at the Ritz, that she found herself in one of two situations. What do you mean, Lieutenant? Didn't he mention it to you? Mention what, Lieutenant? That Mrs. Franklin told him she couldn't take it anymore, that she was either going to kill her husband or take her own life. Mr. Smith stifled a sharp breath. Oh, you know how women can be, Lieutenant. It's just talk. So he wasn't really concerned, then? Well, of course not. No more than you or I would have been. He returned from the Ritz at 6. About that time. And stayed here until I called him. Mr. Smith looked slightly perplexed. Well, not exactly, Lieutenant. Just how exactly, Mr. Smith? Well, he left for dinner right after he came in. Right after 6. Closer to 6:30. And when did he return from dinner? I wasn't here, Lieutenant. I had plans and didn't get back until around midnight. Lieutenant Williams adopted a very casual demeanor. Did Hollander plan to marry Mrs. Franklin after she was divorced? He asked. Goodness, no. There wasn't going to be any divorce. It's purely platonic, and I swear I believe it. That's quite possible. I've never seen her, but the way Tom goes on. She's really quite beautiful. Lieutenant, Mr. Smith, striking dark eyes locked onto Lieutenant Williams's obscured gaze. He thinks she's a saint. I'm serious. Dark and strange, Lieutenant Williams muttered. Dark and strange. What's dark and strange, Lieutenant? The rather terrible things that can happen, Mr. Smith, all under the guise of love. I'll be damned if you talk like a cop, Mr. Smith retorted, suddenly cautious. "Then I suppose you're damned, Mr. Smith." "What?" Lieutenant Williams inquired abruptly, was kept in this. Mr. Smith's attention shifted, distracted by the sudden change of topic. He stared at the leather sheath Lieutenant Williams was holding out toward him. "Some sort of dagger that Tom picked up overseas," he replied. "Damascus steel, he calls it. He uses it as a paper knife." "Curious that it's not in its sheath," said Lieutenant Williams calmly. "Beats me." Lieutenant Williams rummaged through the papers. "It's not here in this desk, either." "Well, I don't know where it is, Lieutenant. It was there this afternoon." "I don't know where it's gone, Mr. Smith, but I intend to find out." "Go ahead. Where did you see it this afternoon? Was it on this desk?" "Yes." Lieutenant Williams searched the desk quickly and thoroughly. The pigeonholes and drawers revealed no trace of the Damascus steel stiletto. Hidden in one of the drawers, he found a copy of the Oxford Book of English Verse, which piqued his interest momentarily. He noted that the most well-thumbed section contained Shakespeare's sonnets, but there was no time for that now, no time. "I'm going to check the other rooms here," he said, "and look for that stiletto." "You're overstepping your authority, if you do, Lieutenant." "Do you have any objections?" Lieutenant Williams asked quietly. Mr. Smith's response was fervent. He had none. Why would he? He had nothing to hide, nor did Hollander. There were certainly a couple of bottles of gin and a quart of scotch on hand, but he didn't think the lieutenant would have any interest in those. The lieutenant confirmed as much, stating that liquor was not within his jurisdiction. So, could they proceed with the search? Lieutenant Williams inquired. Oh, absolutely. Yet, despite his agreement, Mr. Smith trailed behind Lieutenant Williams into the other 2 rooms of the apartment, his demeanor growing increasingly sullen. He hung back just a bit when, after finding nothing, Lieutenant Williams moved to the telephone to call the Franklins. However, the call never went through. Mr. Smith pulled a flexible, leather-bound object from his pocket and struck Lieutenant Williams on the head with it. Chapter 15. 1:13 a.m. The thin steel blade. Miss Murrow was starting to feel restless. Despite all her years of nursing experience, she had never managed to get used to spending an entire night sitting comfortably in a chair. The fidgets had always plagued her, and she knew they would probably continue until she reached the final destination for every dedicated nurse, marrying one of her patients or perhaps a doctor. Of the 2 options, she preferred a patient. She cast a thoughtful glance at the man on the bed. Not that it was much of a consideration, since, she reminded herself firmly, he was already married, although it seemed matters like that rarely deterred anyone. Just look at that fiery Guilford girl who had swept old man Tomlinson right from under his wife's nose, probably because of that nose, which had been quite prominent. Miss Murrow chuckled to herself. It was almost clever enough to share with Mr. Hollander. He must have felt her thoughts turning to him. A curious look had crossed his face when he turned to her, and his eyes seemed to sparkle. Yes, sparkle captured it perfectly. Miss Murrow took pride in her choice of words. Honestly, she mused, I see no reason why I couldn't be a writer. Surely she possessed far greater insight into life than what's found in the ordinary novels. Nonsense. Yes, nonsense was the right term. Naturally, her stories would be anything but ordinary. Just think of that little tale about Delia Hackenpool and the intern with the shifty eyes. Eyes? Yes, Mr. Hollander's eyes sparkled, even in the brief glance she had just caught. But perhaps he, too, was feeling restless. He had been uncharacteristically still for the past 10 minutes. One might almost forget he was there. He certainly was handsome, especially under the soft glow of the distant lamp that illuminated his pale features, which were strikingly pale indeed. She really hoped he wasn't going to get sick or have a nervous breakdown and mess up this perfectly marvelous case of the dear doctor's. Mrs. Sanford Jameson, what a lovely name that would be, so elegant. How fitting that the French had such a flair for it. She learned 10 phrases. Was Mr. Hollander's right hand actually moving, or was it just a trick of the light? It looked like it was sliding slowly off the arm of the chair and was bound to end up in his lap. It was moving. No, it wasn't. Creepy, really. Damn those fidgets. She adjusted her balance a bit and felt some relief. Overstuffed chairs were miserable for sitting too long, if you thought about it, while a good old-fashioned horsehair sofa, like the one Aunt Helen had at Scioto, was far more comfortable. Wait, where did that hand go? It had completely vanished, like a magic trick. It wasn't on the arm of the chair anymore, so it must be in Mr. Hollander's lap after all. So it had been moving, and she hadn't just imagined it. It was almost sneaky of him. His profile was directed toward her. He didn't have a snub nose exactly, nor was it retroussé. You couldn't really apply that term to a man, and whatever else he happened to be, Mr. Hollander was definitely a man. How fascinating his life at sea must have been. She had surely tagged him as a sailor. Lives at sea were always intriguing. All the best stories agreed with that. You never read about a main street on the ocean, with girls in every port, exciting brawls, and the fresh smell of salt in the air. What an insufferable little brat that boy had been down at the beach last summer, with his ridiculous comments about the salty breeze being nothing but rotting lobster traps and dead fish. Of course the ocean air was salty. Sea and salt were one and the same. Mr. Hollander was definitely fidgeting. She couldn't see exactly because of the arm of the chair blocking her view, but he was certainly messing with something. She would think he was just sitting there doing nothing if he had the kind of demeanor that suggested he did, but he didn't, so that wasn't it. She glanced at her wristwatch and noted that the hands were drawing near the half-hour mark. She needed to check on her patient and record his pulse on the chart. It was a shame that the only time you really felt comfortable in an overstuffed chair was right before you had to get up. With a graceful rise, she smoothed her uniform and glided, like a sleek little ship, toward the bed. She flashed a friendly smile at Mr. Hollander before turning her focus to Franklin to take his pulse. She felt a jolt of surprise and concentrated fully on him. "I think there's a change." Hollander looked up with a spark of alertness. "A change. I believe he's showing signs of coming around." For a moment, Miss Murrow noticed the tight lines that suddenly appeared on Hollander's face, making it look older and harsher, altering his features into an expression she couldn't fully define. It seemed like emotional strain was the best explanation for it. "How can you tell?" he asked. Miss Murrow offered a slightly superior smile. "It mostly becomes instinct." "Will it be soon?" "Very soon. Please be careful not to disturb him or make any sudden noises or movements until I return. I want Dr. Jameson to be here before the patient regains consciousness." "Are you going to get him now?" "Yes." She moved toward the bathroom door and called to Christian. "You gentlemen will be careful, I hope, about being seen. I suggest you stay well back from the doorway, as a patient can be rather, well, unpredictable when they come to like this. If he starts moving around, he might catch sight of you." She smiled warmly. "Especially in those uniforms." Miss Murrow let the weight of the potential consequences hang in the air before returning her attention to Franklin. She examined him closely for another moment, checked his pulse again, and then headed for the door. She paused just before reaching the door and said to Hollander, "You might want to make sure to lock the door after I go." Lieutenant Williams insisted it should always be kept locked. "I'll lock it," Hollander replied. "It does seem rather silly, doesn't it?" Hollander gave a wry smile. "Very silly." He stood and joined her at the door. She stepped outside, and he shut the door behind her, locking it securely. For a moment, he gazed blankly at the two policemen, who had shifted their chairs slightly back within the bathroom doorway. Hanson was impassively inspecting the ceiling, while Christian leaned forward, his solemn gaze fixed on the outline of Franklin's still form beneath the bedclothes. Hollander stretched his cramped muscles before returning to his armchair beside the bed. As he sat down, the high back of the chair nearly concealed him from the two guards. With subtle movements, he slid a thin steel blade from beneath the cuff of his left coat sleeve and held it discreetly in his right hand, the hilt peeking just above the cuff of his shirt. He leaned closer, studying Franklin's serene face. Not entirely serene, though. His eyelids twitched, opening slightly, revealing fever-bright eyes that stared unseeing into the distance.